The snow continued its relentless descent through the afternoon, transforming the manor grounds into a landscape of pristine isolation. By 4:30, when the guests were called to dress for dinner, the drifts had begun to obscure the lower windows. Margot seemed delighted by this development, as though she had personally orchestrated the weather as part of her entertainment scheme. She moved through the corridors with renewed energy, checking arrangements with the staff, ensuring that every detail of the evening's festivities would be flawless. Miss Marple dressed slowly in her modest room on the second floor, her fingers working methodically through the buttons of her gray silk dress. From her window, she could see nothing but whiteness now. The world had contracted to the size of the manor itself. It was an oddly intimate situation, she reflected, this forced togetherness. People revealed themselves more honestly when escape became impossible. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock in the dining room, where an enormous mahogany table had been arranged with surgical precision. Margot sat at the head naturally, with Marcus at her right hand and Dr. Pemberton at her left. Catherine found herself across from the vicar's wife, a position that seemed to displease her considerably. Iris Blackwood was placed between Reverend Hartley and Timothy Crane, an arrangement that Miss Marple suspected was deliberate. Margot likely believed that the young constable's presence would prevent any awkwardness. The dinner itself was excellent. A clear soup course, followed by sole, and then a roasted pheasant that must have cost Margot a small fortune. The conversation flowed with the artificial quality of social obligation, touching on village improvements, the upcoming Christmas service, and speculation about Boxing Day. Festivities that might or might not occur depending on the weather's mercy. Yet beneath this pleasant surface, Miss Marple detected currents running far deeper. She noticed that Iris Blackwood ate almost nothing, pushing food around her plate with mechanical disinterest. More significantly, she observed the way Marcus Ashford's eyes would occasionally flick toward his aunt with an expression that seemed to calculate something, though whether it was affection or interest in the eventual disposition of her considerable fortune remained unclear. When Margot mentioned, quite casually, that she had decided to delay her move to the coast by several months, Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Only Miss Marple seemed to notice. Catherine, for her part, appeared agitated in a way that went beyond typical youthful restlessness. Her mobile telephone sat beside her plate despite the house rules about such things at table, and she checked it repeatedly with the anxiety of someone awaiting urgent news. When Reverend Hartley attempted to engage her in conversation about her university studies, she offered only monosyllabic responses before returning her attention to the device. Dr. Pemberton drank heavily, 3 glasses of wine during the meal, then port afterward, and his conversation became increasingly rambling. He spoke at length about the pressures of his medical practice, about the ways in which people expected him to cure ailments that modern medicine couldn't touch. There was bitterness beneath his words, Miss Marple noted, a resentment that seemed to extend beyond mere professional frustration. After dinner, they retired to the drawing room, where a fire had been built up against the increasing cold. Margot suggested cards, and a game of bridge was arranged. Miss Marple excused herself, claiming fatigue from the journey, and took instead to her knitting in a corner chair where she could observe without participating. From this position, she found herself privy to numerous small interactions that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. She saw Marcus slip a piece of paper to Catherine when he thought no one was watching. She observed Iris Blackwood pour herself a drink from the sideboard with the studied casualness of someone who had done so many times before. She watched Patricia Hartley lean toward her husband and whisper something that made his expression darken considerably, though she could not discern the words. At 10:30, Margot announced that the roads were now completely impossible and that everyone should prepare for at least 2 days' isolation. This news was received with varying degrees of reaction. Timothy seemed concerned about village duties. The vicar appeared anxious about Sunday services, and Dr. Pemberton simply nodded as though this were merely one more complication in a day already laden with them. As the guests began to retire, making their way up the grand staircase to their assigned rooms, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting needles working steadily through a tea. particularly complex Fair Isle pattern. She was thinking about the way people behaved when they believed themselves trapped, about how isolation had a way of bringing long, suppressed tensions to the surface. The manor had become, in the space of an afternoon, something rather different from what it had been, no longer simply a setting for Christmas hospitality, but a contained space where secrets and resentments could no longer be so easily compartmentalized. It was a little after midnight when the first scream shattered the silence of the manor, echoing down the corridor with the unmistakable quality of genuine terror. Miss Marple set down her knitting with the calm of someone who had been half expecting such an eventuality, and she rose to see what catastrophe the Snowbound Manor had finally produced. The scream had come from somewhere in the East Wing, and by the time Miss Marple reached the corridor, several other guests had already emerged from their rooms in various states of dishabille. Timothy Crane was already moving toward the purposefulness of his office, while Dr. Pemberton stood uncertainly in his doorway, clearly struggling between the desire to remain uninvolved and the professional obligation to respond to a medical emergency. It was Reverend Hartley who reached the source first, Catherine Ashford's room, where the young woman stood in her nightgown, pointing with a trembling finger toward her window. For a moment, nothing made sense. Catherine was babbling incoherently about someone trying to get in, about a face at the glass, about the terror of seeing a human silhouette against the snow-covered pane. But as the group gathered, studying the window in question, the explanation became immediately apparent. The glass bore 3 distinct cracks radiating from a central point where something, or someone, had struck it from the outside. Snow had drifted against the exterior wall, and there, in the white expanse below the window, was a set of footprints, partially filled but still visible enough to trace a path, away from the manor toward the grounds beyond. "Someone was trying to break in," Timothy said, his tone mixing professional concern with a hint of skepticism. Though why anyone would attempt such a thing in weather like this, "It wasn't an attempt to break in," Miss Marple said quietly from her position near the door. Everyone turned to look at her. The crack pattern suggests the blow came from inside the room, striking outward with considerable force. Someone was attempting to break out. A peculiar silence followed this observation. Catherine's face had gone quite past pale, and she wrapped her arms around herself defensively. Patricia Hartley moved to comfort her, while Marcus appeared to be calculating the implications as with his characteristic detachment. It was Dr. Pemberton, however, who voiced what everyone was thinking. But why would anyone wish to escape through a window in weather conditions like these? Suicide? He glanced uncomfortably at Margot, as though concerned that such an unseemly suggestion might offend their hostess. "Hardly suicide," Timothy said, recovering his composure. "Suicide typically involves leaving, not arriving. The footprints in the snow, they lead away from the manor, but they also lead toward it. Someone came from outside, stood at this window, and struck it. The question is why." Margot had arrived by this point, summoned by one of the servants, and she surveyed the scene with an expression of consternation that seemed genuine enough. She was still dressed, Miss Marple noticed, a point worth noting, though one couldn't immediately determine its significance. The lady of the manor was dressed in the same emerald gown she had worn at dinner, which suggested she had not yet retired for the evening, despite the hour approaching 1:00 in the morning. "This is most distressing," Margot said, her voice steady, but her hands betraying agitation through their perpetual motion. "Timothy, surely this is some village youth attempting a prank? The snow has made them foolish?" But Timothy was not convinced, and neither was Miss Marple. The footprints in the snow told a different story. They spoke of intentionality, of purpose. Someone had made their way through a blizzard specifically to reach this window, to strike it with enough force to crack the glass. This was not the action of a prankster or a bored youth seeking entertainment. Catherine, gradually recovering her composure, offered surprisingly little information. She had been preparing for bed when she heard the sound. A dull thud against the window followed immediately by the crack of breaking glass. She had screamed in fright, she said, and then others had come No, she had not seen a face clearly. Yes, there had been a shadow, but the snow and darkness made it impossible to identify anyone. As the group dispersed back to their rooms, Timothy taking detailed notes and promising to investigate further in the morning when the light would permit a fuller examination of Apua. The grounds. Miss Marple found herself walking beside Dr. Pemberton in the corridor. The physician seemed unsettled in a way that went beyond concern for Catherine's welfare. "Odd business," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Very odd indeed. This sort of thing doesn't happen in villages like Ashford in the snow." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied gently, "this sort of thing happens everywhere. It simply wears different faces in different locations. The motivations remain remarkably consistent. Desperation, love, fear, or occasionally a combination of all three, Dr. Pemberton shot her an odd look, as though wondering whether her comments carried some deeper meaning he was meant to decipher. Before he could respond, Iris Blackwood appeared from her room, seemingly drawn by the commotion. Her expression was difficult to read, though Miss Marple detected what might have been satisfaction beneath the surface concern. Later, lying in her narrow bed in her assigned room, Miss Marple considered the evening's events. The broken window seemed significant, but not in the way the others assumed. The footprints in the snow, the timing of the incident, Catherine's agitation that had preceded the night's excitement, these elements suggested a pattern, though one that remained frustratingly incomplete. Someone in Thornfield Manor harbored secrets sufficiently dangerous to warrant midnight violence in a snowstorm. By morning, Miss Marple suspected, those secrets would begin to unravel in ways that would change everything about this supposedly peaceful Christmas gathering. Morning arrived reluctantly, as though the winter sun itself had little enthusiasm for illuminating the Snowbound Manor. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and made her way downstairs to find Timothy already in the breakfast room, a cup of tea cooling before him while he studied a notebook, filled with observations from his examination of the grounds outside Catherine's window. "The snow's covered most of the evidence," he said by way of greeting, gesturing for Miss Marple to join him. "But what remains tells an interesting story. 2 sets of footprints, as far as I can determine, one arriving at the window, one departing. Both lead in the direction of the old gamekeeper's cottage, which has been empty for 3 years since old Mr. Whitmore passed. The prints are deep, which suggests whoever made them was either carrying something or moving with considerable urgency." Miss Marple settled herself with a cup of tea and a slice of toast. "And when do you estimate these prints were made?" "The fresh snow stopped at approximately 2 in the morning, Timothy replied. "The prints would have to have been made within an hour or 2 either side of that window incident, given how quickly they're being filled in by the continuing drift. So somewhere between midnight and 3 o'clock. "Which means," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, "that whoever made those prints would have needed to leave the manor sometime before the disturbance at Catherine's window, traverse the grounds in a blizzard, strike the window, and then return, all without being observed. Or they were already outside when the incident occurred." Timothy frowned, considering this. "The servants have checked. No one left the manor last night. The doors are all locked, and with the snow, anyone departing would have left obvious tracks. Besides, why would someone inside the manor break a window from the inside and then create footprints to make it appear as though an outsider was responsible?" "An excellent question," Miss Marple said, "and one that might require us to reconsider our initial assumptions." Before Timothy could respond, Margot entered the breakfast room with the determined cheerfulness of someone who had made a decision to treat the previous evening's disturbance as merely a minor interruption to her carefully orchestrated festivities. She was followed closely by Marcus, whose expression suggested he had been engaged in an intense conversation with his aunt just prior to their arrival. "Such drama," Margot announced, moving toward the sideboard where the servants had arranged an impressive array of breakfast items. "I've decided we shall treat it as a Christmas adventure rather than a genuine concern. After all, everyone is quite safe within these walls, and the constabulary will sort out the matter soon enough." Yet despite her words, Margot's composure seemed somewhat fragile. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured her coffee, and her attention kept drifting toward the windows, as though she were calculating something beyond Miss Marple's immediate comprehension. Marcus, meanwhile, was studying his aunt with an intensity that suggested his concerns extended far beyond mere curiosity about the window incident. The other guests gradually assembled for breakfast, each bringing their own peculiar tension to the meal. Catherine appeared substantially recovered from the previous night's fright, though she remained notably quieter than she had been the evening before. Dr. Pemberton seemed to have developed a slight tremor in his hands, which he attempted to conceal by keeping them occupied with his breakfast plate. Iris Blackwood arrived last, and Miss Marple noted that her hair appeared slightly damp, as though she had recently washed it, and there were traces of mud beneath her, fingernails that suggested recent outdoor activity. "I was wondering," Miss Marple said conversationally to Iris as they found themselves momentarily alone while the others attended to their meals, "whether you slept well despite last night's excitement." Iris turned to her with an expression that flickered briefly through something, guilt, fear, before settling into polite neutrality. "Adequately, thank you for asking. Though I confess the disturbance was startling. I haven't heard a sound like that since my days working in the city, actually. Before I came to Ashford in the snow." "How long ago was that?" Miss Marple inquired with her characteristic gentleness. 31 years, Iris replied, and there was a quality in her voice that suggested those years had been neither particularly happy nor particularly forgettable. I've been secretary to various solicitors and businessmen during that time. The last position, of course, was with the late Mr. Henry Ashford. May he rest in peace. The phrase was conventional enough, but the way Iris delivered it suggested that peace was precisely what Henry Ashford had not found in his lifetime, nor what Iris had found in the years following his death. Miss Marple filed this observation away alongside the others that had accumulated since her arrival at the manor. After breakfast, as the household settled into the peculiar routine that snowbound situations imposed, Miss Marple positioned herself in the library with her knitting, a room that enjoyed excellent sight lines to the main corridor and the staircase. From this vantage point, she observed the various comings and goings of her fellow guests with meticulous attention. She saw Marcus disappear into Margot's study for nearly 40 minutes, emerging with an expression of thinly veiled anger. She observed Dr. Pemberton and the vicar engaged in what appeared to be a heated, whispered conversation near the drawing room's closed doors. Most significantly, she noticed Catherine slip a telephone message, hastily written on hotel stationery, into Iris Blackwood's hand when they thought themselves unobserved. The snowstorm continued unabated outside, sealing the manor off from the wider world. Within these walls, Miss Marple reflected, secrets were accumulating with the snow itself, building towards some inevitable crisis that the morning's disturbance had merely prefigured. The broken window was not the real problem, she suspected. It was merely a symptom of something far deeper and considerably more dangerous. By late afternoon, the atmosphere within Thornfield Manor had grown decidedly tense. The snow continued its relentless accumulation, and with it came the increasing realization that the guests were not merely delayed, but genuinely trapped. The electricity of the previous evening had transformed into something more anxious, more brittle. Conversations died prematurely. People drifted into rooms, only to drift out again moments later. The comfortable rhythms of a country house party had been disrupted by something that no amount of elegant hospitality could quite disguise. It was during tea that the first crack in Margot's carefully maintained composure appeared. Reverend Hartley, making conversation about the upcoming Christmas service, mentioned having seen tracks near the gamekeeper's cottage that morning while taking a constitutional walk despite the weather. He described discovering what appeared to be a small camp, a makeshift shelter of branches and canvas recently abandoned, with evidence of a fire that had been extinguished only hours before. Margot's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Her face, already pale from the winter light filtering through the snow-laden windows, seemed to lose what little color remained. She set the cup down with deliberate care, as though any sudden movement might shatter something far more fragile than porcelain. "How curious," she said finally, her voice emerging slightly higher than its normal register. I hadn't realized we had vagrants in the area." "Timothy, surely this explains last night's disturbance? Someone seeking shelter from the weather, perhaps grown desperate when refused entry?" But Timothy was studying his notes with an expression that suggested he had already considered and rejected this theory. "The gamekeeper's cottage is nearly a quarter-mile from the manor," he said slowly. "It would be an odd choice for someone simply seeking immediate shelter, and the tracks from Catherine's window lead in that direction, suggesting whoever struck the glass came from that camp, not that they were heading toward it. Perhaps they were traveling between locations," Marcus suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe his own hypothesis. "Making their way across the estate in search of assistance?" Miss Marple, observing this exchange from her position near the window, noticed something that the others seemed to have overlooked. Patricia Hartley's hands were shaking so severely that she could barely hold a teacup. The vicar's wife, typically the embodiment of practiced composure, appeared to be on the verge of some kind of emotional collapse. Moreover, she kept glancing toward her husband, with an expression that mingled desperation and something approaching accusation. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said quietly, "we ought to consider what the camp's recent abandonment might suggest. If someone had taken shelter there intentionally, they would likely have secured their position more carefully. The fact that it was hastily abandoned speaks to sudden necessity or sudden discovery." "What are you suggesting?" Margot asked, and there was a quality in her voice that suggested she already knew the answer and was hoping to prevent its articulation. "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied gently, "merely observing that actions often reveal intentions more clearly than words ever could." The tension that followed this statement was profound enough to be almost visible, hanging in the air like smoke. It was Iris Blackwood who attempted to diffuse it by rising abruptly and announcing that she intended to write some correspondence while the afternoon light remained. Her departure seemed to trigger a general dissolution of the gathering. Within minutes, the tea service had been abandoned, and the guests had scattered to various parts of the manor. That evening, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Timothy in Margot's study. Once the door was closed, she spoke with a directness that she reserved for those rare individuals capable of understanding the genuine complexity of human motivation. "The broken window was not the work of a vagrant," she said, "and I suspect Timothy already knows this. What I am curious about is whether you've considered the alternative, that someone in this house deliberately created the appearance of an outside threat." Timothy was quiet for a long moment. "The physics of the glass fracture would support that theory," he admitted, "but the motive remains unclear. Why would someone deliberately strike their own window from inside?" "To create a distraction," Miss Marple replied. "Or to provide justification for some action they intended to take. Or perhaps, and this seems most likely, to send a message to someone else within the household. A warning, perhaps, or a threat." "You suspect someone specific?" Timothy asked. "I suspect several someones," Miss Marple said. "But suspicion and evidence are quite different things. What I would suggest is that you examine the mud beneath Iris Blackwood's fingernails more carefully. Have it tested. And I would also inquire, very delicately, about the nature of Dr. Pemberton's relationship with the Hartley family. There appears to be some history there that has not yet been articulated." Timothy made notes while Miss Marple continued her quiet exposition of observations, the way Catherine's hands shook when she held the note she had passed to Iris, the deliberation with which Margot had avoided looking at certain guests throughout the day, the peculiarity, nervousness that seemed to afflict multiple people in ways that suggested shared knowledge of some secret. "There's a murder coming," Miss Marple said finally, with a certainty that came from 70 years of observing human nature. "Not the broken window. That was merely preamble. But before this Christmas gathering concludes, someone will die, and the circumstances will be constructed to appear accidental or the result of the supposed vagrant threat. We must be very careful to observe everything, Timothy, and to believe nothing that seems obvious." As she returned to her room that night, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of secrets in small communities. They accumulated like the snow outside, growing heavier with each passing day until suddenly, catastrophically, they became too heavy to bear. Tomorrow would likely bring the breaking point. Tonight, she would ensure she remained vigilant, watching for the moment when desperation finally overcame caution. The catastrophe arrived not with dramatic violence, but with the prosaic discovery of an empty bed. It was one of the housemaids who found it, around 7 o'clock on the morning of the second full day of the snowstorm. Pemberton's room showed no signs of struggle, no indication of emergency. His clothes remained in the wardrobe, his toiletries arranged neatly on the washstand. He had simply vanished during the night, leaving behind only an absence that seemed to gather weight with each passing moment. Margot's reaction was immediate and theatrical, perhaps too theatrical, Miss Marple observed, for someone discovering that a guest had gone missing in weather conditions that virtually guaranteed danger or death. Within an hour, the entire household was in upheaval. Timothy organized a search of the manor's interior, while servants were dispatched to examine the grounds despite the continuing snowfall. The roads remained impassable, ruling out any possibility that Dr. Pemberton had managed to reach the village. It was Catherine who provided the first genuine lead, though she seemed reluctant to do so. When Timothy questioned her directly about her father's state of mind, she became evasive, her eyes darting toward Patricia Hartley with an expression that mingled fear and something approaching guilt. Under gentle but persistent questioning, Catherine finally admitted that her father had received a message, delivered by Iris Blackwood, some time after dinner the previous evening. The content of the message, Catherine claimed, she did not know, but her father had become increasingly agitated following its receipt. "Where would he go?" Timothy asked. "Is there anywhere on the grounds he might seek shelter?" "The old boathouse," Patricia Hartley said suddenly, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Down by the lake. It's about half a mile through the woods." If he needed to go somewhere private, her statement hung in the air, raising more questions than it answered. Why would Dr. Pemberton venture to a boathouse in the middle of a blizzard? And why did Patricia Hartley seem to know his likely destination with such certainty? The vicar's wife's face had gone ashen, and she was gripping her husband's arm with almost desperate intensity, as though she feared he might flee if she released him. Miss Marple found herself alone with Iris Blackwood in the corridor as servants rushed past on various errands. The older woman's composure had finally cracked. Her hands trembled, and there was a wildness in her eyes that suggested she had reached some critical point beyond which careful deception became impossible. "He's going to die," Iris said without preamble. "That's what will happen, isn't it? He'll be found in the snow, and everyone will assume it was an accident. The weather, the darkness, a simple mistake. No one will question it because no one ever questions anything properly in places like this." "Why did you send him the message?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I didn't," Iris replied. "Not directly, but I told someone where he would be most vulnerable, where secrets could be used most effectively. I didn't imagine they would actually—" She trailed off, her distress becoming more acute. Miss Marple guided her to a small sitting room adjacent to the corridor, and they sat in the dimness of afternoon light, filtered through snow-covered windows. Slowly, piece by piece, a story emerged that transformed everything about the morning's crisis. Dr. Pemberton had not been simply a country physician. 30 years prior, he had been involved in an incident that had cost a young woman her life. A case of medical negligence that had been covered up through a combination of professional courtesy and financial inducement. The woman had been Iris Blackwood's younger sister. The inducement had come from Henry Ashford, whose legal counsel had ensured that no official investigation would occur. Pemberton had been protected, promoted, rewarded for his silence about circumstances that had involved more than simple medical error. She was pregnant, Iris said, her voice hollow with the weight of 3 decades' accumulated grief. The pregnancy was concealed because the father was someone whose social position made such a situation inconvenient. Pemberton was paid to falsify records, When complications arose, he was too frightened to call for proper assistance. By the time he finally did, it was too late. "And you've carried this knowledge all these years?" Miss Marple asked. "Since I took the position with Henry Ashford," Iris confirmed. "I discovered the documentation by accident. He knew I'd found it, and rather than dismiss me, he kept me employed. He said it was more economical to have me where he could see me. 3 decades of being held in that particular form of captivity." Miss Marple processed this information with the careful deliberation that characterized her approach to human tragedy. "And now? Why reveal this now?" "Because Margot is planning to marry again," Iris said. "A man from London, quite wealthy. She's disposing of her past, you see, reorganizing her life. She wanted to ensure there were no uncomfortable associations, no complications. She asked me, quite directly, to solve the problem of Dr. Pemberton's continued presence in the village. She didn't ask it outright, of course, but the implication was clear enough. She offered me a substantial sum to leave Ashford in the snow permanently. I realized then that she intended to eliminate him entirely. To have someone ensure his death appeared accidental. "You told someone about the boathouse," Miss Marple said slowly. "Someone who had their own motivations for seeing Dr. Pemberton dead." "I thought I was warning him," Iris protested. "I thought if he knew Margot was arranging his removal, he would flee, would escape. I sent the message telling him to meet me at the boathouse, that I would help him get away. But when I arrived, she stopped and her face crumpled. He was already there. He was already dead." The discovery of Dr. Pemberton's body came within the hour. Timothy, accompanied by 2 of the manor's groundskeepers, found him in the boathouse exactly where Iris had described. Slumped in a wooden chair overlooking the frozen lake, iced half-empty bottle of laudanum beside him on a small table. At first glance, it appeared to be precisely what Margot had likely intended. A suicide, the desperate act of a man driven to desperation by conscience or circumstance. The snow had drifted through the boathouse's open door, partially obscuring the body, suggesting he had been there since some time after midnight. But Miss Marple, arriving shortly after Timothy had secured the scene, noticed details that suggested a far more sinister narrative. The bottle of laudanum, while indeed partially emptied, bore traces of a substance that was not consistent with simple dissolution in liquid. More significantly, there was no cup near the body, no vessel from which Dr. Pemberton might have consumed the poison. His lips showed no discoloration typical of laudanum ingestion, and his hands, though cold, bore marks on the wrists consistent with restraint rather than voluntary repose. "Someone held him here," Miss Marple said quietly to Timothy, who was still processing the scene, "and forced the laudanum into him, making it appear as though he had chosen this end himself. The marks on his wrists suggest he struggled, but the isolation of this location, combined with the weather, would have rendered any cries for help inaudible to the manor." Timothy's face had gone pale. "But who would Iris Blackwood?" "Iris is many things," Miss Marple replied. "But she is not a murderer. She is, however, a woman who inadvertently provided a weapon to someone else. Someone who had their own compelling reasons for seeing Dr. Pemberton dead. Someone, moreover, who understood that Iris's revelation of the doctor's past sins would create the perfect smokescreen for his murder." They returned to the manor in silence, Timothy wrestling with the implications of what they had discovered. The official story would be suicide, Miss Marple knew. The authorities would be grateful for such a neat conclusion. But the truth was far more complicated, involving layers of art, deception, and manipulation that extended deep into the heart of Thornfield Manor's supposedly respectable household. The announcement of Dr. Pemberton's death sent shockwaves through the manor's residents. Catherine collapsed into near hysterical grief, though Miss Marple detected beneath the tears something more complex, a mixture of guilt and relief that suggested the young woman harbored her own secrets regarding her father. Patricia Hartley became nearly catatonic, requiring the ministrations of Reverend Hartley to maintain any semblance of composure. Most revealing, however, was the reaction of those who attempted to conceal their true feelings behind masks of appropriate mourning. Margot, when informed, had gone very still. Her hand trembled as she pressed it to her mouth, and in that moment of unguarded emotion, Miss Marple saw something flicker across her face. Not grief, but calculation. The death had disrupted her plans, complicated her careful orchestration of events. The financial arrangements she had been making with Iris would now be rendered moot, or would require significant renegotiation. Marcus, conversely, seemed almost relieved. The tension that had characterized his demeanor throughout the visit had eased measurably. He conferred briefly with his aunt in hushed tones, and Miss Marple caught fragments of conversation that included the words liability and insurance. Whatever complications Dr. Pemberton's presence had represented, his death appeared to have resolved them to Marcus's satisfaction. That afternoon, as snow continued its relentless descent and the manor settled into the peculiar quietude that follows sudden death, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Catherine. They met in the library, where the young woman sat rigidly on a settee, her eyes red from crying but her expression strangely composed. "Your father was a troubled man," Miss Marple began gently, "burdened by things he had done or failed to do many years ago. You were aware of this, I think." Catherine nodded slowly. "He told me everything last year. About my aunt, my father's sister whom I never knew. About what happened to her and how he'd been made to conceal it. He said he wanted to confess, to make things right, but he was afraid. Afraid of losing his position, his reputation, everything." "And you told someone about this?" Miss Marple asked. "I told Iris," Catherine admitted. "I saw her crying once in the kitchen, and I asked her what was wrong. She was guarded at first, but eventually she told me about her sister. I felt I owed her honesty in return. I told her about Father's guilt, about the accident, everything. I thought perhaps she would forgive him if she understood how much he regretted it." "But someone else learned this information," Miss Marple said. "Someone who used it not for forgiveness, but for murder." Catherine's face crumpled. "I don't understand. Who would want to kill Father?" "That is what we must determine," Miss Marple replied. "Tell me, that note you passed to Iris yesterday, what did it contain?" "A warning," Catherine said. "From Patricia Hartley. She came to my room and asked me to deliver it. She said my father was in danger, that someone in the house meant him harm. She said Iris would know what to do, that Iris had already begun preparing an escape route. But I don't understand any of this. Patricia was my father's friend. Why would she warn him if someone was planning?" She stopped abruptly, realization dawning across her features. Unless she wasn't warning him to help him escape. Unless she was telling him where to go, so that someone else would know where to find him. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pattern was becoming clearer now. The intricate web of manipulation and counter-manipulation that had culminated in Dr. Pemberton's death. But the identity of the actual murderer remained obscured, hidden behind layers of misdirection and carefully orchestrated chaos. That evening, as the manor settled into the strange rituals that death imposed upon households, Miss Marple found herself in the drawing room, observing the interactions between the remaining guests. With renewed intensity, the snow had finally ceased, though the drifts had accumulated to such a degree that the roads remained completely impassable. They were still trapped, all of them, in this isolated manor, where a man had died under circumstances that grew more suspicious with each passing hour. Patricia Hartley sat rigid on an upright chair near the fire, her husband beside her in a posture that suggested less comfort and more duty. They barely spoke to each other, and when they did, their exchanges were strained, conducted in undertones that suggested they feared being overheard. Reverend Hartley's face bore the expression of a man wrestling with something far more profound than simple grief, something that touched upon his fundamental understanding of morality and obligation. It was this last observation that prompted Miss Marple's next move. She excused herself from the drawing room and made her way to the study where Timothy had established a makeshift investigation area. The constable looked exhausted, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had occurred and deeply aware that he was operating far beyond the scope of his usual rural village duties. "I believe," Miss Marple said without preamble, "that Reverend Hartley requires questioning about his relationship with Dr. Pemberton. There is that history there that goes beyond simple professional acquaintance, and I suspect it involves Patricia directly." Timothy appeared skeptical. "The vicar? Surely you don't suspect a man of the cloth?" "I suspect all people equally," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "The cloth one wears is merely fabric. It conceals human nature rather than transforming it. What I would like to know is whether Reverend Hartley was aware of Dr. Pemberton's past sins, and if so, how he came to possess such knowledge." The questioning that followed was conducted with delicate precision. Reverend Hartley, initially defensive, eventually revealed a truth that had apparently gnawed at his conscience for some years. Patricia, before her marriage to Colin Hartley, had been a nurse at the hospital where Dr. Pemberton practiced. She had been present during the incident that had resulted in Iris Blackwood's sister's death. She had witnessed the negligence, the subsequent cover-up, and had been implicitly threatened by both Pemberton and his legal protectors to maintain her silence. "She's carried that burden her entire life," Reverend Hartley said, his voice heavy with accumulated anguish. "We married believing the matter was settled, that speaking of it would only cause suffering without achieving justice. But last month she received a letter, anonymous, but clearly from someone who knew the details. The letter threatened to expose everything unless she paid a substantial sum by the end of the year." "Blackmail," Timothy said flatly. "Precisely," the vicar confirmed. "Patricia was frantic. She didn't know how to tell me, how to explain this additional burden. When I finally convinced her to confess, I became angry. Angry at Pemberton for his original crime. Angry at the injustice of the situation. And yes, I became angry at Patricia for carrying this secret alone for so long without seeking help from her own husband." "Who sent the letter?" Miss Marple asked. "We never determined that," Reverend Hartley replied. "But the arrival of the letter precipitated everything that followed. Patricia, seeking some form of resolution or confession, approached Iris Blackwood and revealed the truth about her sister's death. She was hoping, I think, to create some form of accountability or at least acknowledgement of the injustice. Miss Marple's mind was working through the implications with characteristic precision. The blackmail letter was significant. It suggested someone else knew about Dr. Pemberton's past, someone with sufficient knowledge to weaponize that information. Someone, moreover, who stood to benefit from Pemberton's removal. "The letter," Miss Marple said slowly, "did it specify what information would be exposed, or did it merely reference your wife's knowledge of past events?" "It was quite specific," Reverend Hartley said. "It referenced the incident by date, location, and the names of those involved. Whoever sent it possessed detailed knowledge that only a handful of people could possibly have." After the vicar had been dismissed, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence. The pattern was becoming clearer, though several crucial elements remained obscured. Someone had blackmailed Patricia Hartley. That same someone had likely orchestrated Dr. Pemberton's murder, using the accumulated tensions and secrets as convenient cover for their true purpose. But who possessed both the knowledge and the motivation? It was Margot, Miss Marple realized. Margot, who had employed Iris for 3 decades and would have known about her sister's death. Margot, who had likely discovered through her solicitor connections the same information that Dr. Pemberton had so desperately concealed. Margot, who was now preparing to reshape her life and would require the elimination of anyone who might complicate that fresh beginning. But something didn't quite align. If Margot had orchestrated the blackmail and the subsequent murder, why would she have also commissioned Iris to arrange Pemberton's removal? The redundancy suggested either desperate paranoia or something far more complex, a situation where multiple people harbored separate but compatible goals regarding Dr. Pemberton's death. That night, Miss Marple lay in her narrow bed, her mind working through the intersecting motivations and concealed histories that had converged in this snowbound manor. 3 people at minimum had wanted Dr. Pemberton dead. Margot Ashford, who sought to control threats to her reputation, Patricia Hartley, who carried the weight of his original crime, and possibly Iris Blackwood herself, driven by decades of grief and rage toward the man who had killed her sister. But which of them had possessed the will and opportunity to actually administer the poison? Which of them had stood in that boathouse in the freezing darkness and forced a dying man to drink laudanum while restraining his wrists? Tomorrow, Miss Marple resolved, she would ensure the truth emerged, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might prove for everyone involved. Morning brought with it a peculiar clarity that seemed to accompany the cessation of the snowstorm. The roads, while still heavily drifted, had become technically possible for determined travelers, and the promise of escape hung over the manor like a benediction. Yet Miss Marple knew that true escape would not come for any of them until the truth had been fully articulated. Secrets, once exposed to air, had a way of demanding acknowledgement. She found Timothy in the breakfast room, looking substantially worse than he had the previous evening. The young constable was wrestling with the weight of his responsibility. The recognition that a crime of significant magnitude had occurred within his jurisdiction and that his investigation would determine how justice, or the appearance of justice, would be served. "I've been thinking about the broken window," Miss Marple said, seating herself across from him. The initial disturbance that precipitated everything else. "Have you given further consideration to who might have struck it from within?" Timothy set down his coffee cup. "I assumed it was connected to Pemberton's death. Some form of warning or threat designed to create chaos that might cover the actual crime." "A reasonable assumption," Miss Marple agreed, "but not, I believe, an accurate one. The window was broken before anyone knew with certainty that Pemberton would be murdered. What if it was an act of genuine desperation by someone seeking to communicate something they feared expressing through normal channels?" "Catherine?" Timothy asked slowly. "But she was the one screaming about it." "Precisely," Miss Marple confirmed, which made her the perfect person to discover it. Someone struck that window deliberately, knowing it would startle Catherine, knowing she would scream and draw attention, not to threaten her, but to create a disturbance significant enough that she would be forced to explain it. And in explaining it, forced to acknowledge her presence in this household and the secrets she carries. As she spoke, Miss Marple rose and made her way to the window, gazing out at the transformed landscape. The manor grounds were pristine now, the violence of the previous days obscured beneath unmarked snow. Yet beneath that surface lay the detritus of human conflict, footprints, evidence, the physical manifestation of emotional turmoil. "I believe," Miss Marple continued, "that Catherine deliberately broke that window. She was attempting to alert someone to the situation developing within this house. Someone on the outside who needed to know that matters were approaching a crisis point." "But the footprints led toward the gamekeeper's cottage," Timothy protested. "The footprints made by someone else entirely," Miss Marple said. "Someone who wished us to believe in the existence of an external threat while actually using that threat as cover for their true purpose. Catherine's window breaking was a desperate act of communication. The subsequent footprints were a calculated misdirection." Before Timothy could respond, a commotion erupted from the hallway outside the breakfast room. Margot's voice, sharp with command, was giving orders to the servants about preparing vehicles for departure. The roads were passable enough, she had apparently decided, and the household would be dispersing. The Christmas gathering had concluded, though not in the manner any of them had anticipated. Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the drawing room, where she found Margot organizing the logistics of departure with the precision that characterized all her own activities. Marcus stood nearby, his expression suggesting he had already negotiated the terms of his own escape with considerable efficiency. "Before anyone leaves," Miss Marple said quietly from the doorway, "I believe there are certain matters that require clarification." particularly regarding the nature of the blackmail letter and who might have possessed the knowledge and motivation to send it. Margot's hands stilled. When she turned, her face had assumed an expression of polite incomprehension, though her eyes betrayed something far darker. "I'm not certain what you're referring to, Miss Marple. The tragedy involving Dr. Pemberton has been quite sufficient without introducing additional complications." The letter sent to Patricia Hartley referenced events from 30 years ago with remarkable specificity, Miss Marple continued. Events that only a handful of people could possibly know about in such detail. Events involving Dr. Pemberton, your late husband, and a young woman named Margaret Blackwood, who died under circumstances that were deliberately concealed. "That's a very serious accusation," Margot said coldly. "It is an observation, not an accusation," Miss Marple corrected. "I'm simply noting that you possessed both the knowledge and the motivation to send such a letter. Your husband's solicitor would have retained documentation of the original cover-up. You would have discovered that documentation after his death. And you would have recognized that Dr. Pemberton represented a liability, a man whose continued existence might at any moment result in the exposure of your late husband's moral failings." Margot's facade cracked slightly. "My husband is dead. Why would it matter what he did or didn't do decades ago?" "It wouldn't matter," Miss Marple agreed, "except that you were preparing to remarry. A man of sufficient social standing that any association with scandal would be considered unacceptable. Pemberton's continued existence represented a potential threat to your carefully constructed future. Even if what you're suggesting were true," Margot said, her voice hardening, "it would not constitute murder. Blackmail is a civil matter, not a criminal one. And whatever may have occurred to Dr. Pemberton, I had nothing to do with it directly." "No," Miss Marple said sadly, "you did not. But you set in motion the events that culminated in his death. You wrote that letter knowing it would destabilize Patricia Hartley, knowing it would force her to confront Dr. Pemberton about his past crimes. You knew, moreover, that such confrontation would likely drive him to desperate measures." "That's not murder," Margot insisted. "That's merely a consequence." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Or is it something far more calculated? Someone in this house administered the laudanum that killed Dr. Pemberton. Someone restrained his wrists while forcing poison into him. And I believe that someone acted with your implicit encouragement, if not your explicit instruction." The drawing room had become very quiet. Everyone present seemed to sense that they were approaching the moment when careful deceptions would finally yield to uncomfortable truths. It was Marcus who moved first, attempting to edge toward the doorway with the calculated nonchalance of someone seeking to extract himself from a situation that had become unexpectedly complicated. Miss Marple's gentle voice stopped him as effectively as a physical barrier. "Your motivation was quite different from your aunt's, wasn't it, Marcus? You weren't concerned with scandal or reputation. You were concerned with money." Marcus froze. His carefully maintained composure flickered, revealing something far more volatile beneath the surface. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Dr. Pemberton held a significant life insurance policy," Miss Marple continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "One that was set to mature within months, with the proceeds designated to flow into the estate trust that your aunt controls. You discovered this information during your financial investigations of her assets. Investigations ostensibly conducted to prepare for her retirement to the coast. You realized that Dr. Pemberton's death would accelerate your access to substantial funds. More significantly, you recognized that his death could be arranged to appear accidental or suicidal, with no one suspecting anything more than the tragedy of a man broken by guilt." "This is absurd," Marcus said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "The broken window," Miss Marple said, turning her attention back to Margot, "was not Catherine's desperate communication, though I suspect she may have misunderstood its purpose. It was Marcus, wasn't it? He struck that window from within Catherine's room to create the appearance of an external threat. The footprints leading to the gamekeeper's cottage were his as well. He created that false trail quite deliberately, knowing it would lead Timothy's investigation in the wrong direction. Margot's face had gone very pale. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling. When she spoke, her voice emerged barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I truly didn't know that Marcus intended—" "Didn't you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Or did you simply choose not to ask questions whose answers you could predict? You sent that blackmail letter knowing it would create chaos. You confided in Marcus about Dr. Pemberton's past, about the liability he represented. And then, when convenient opportunities presented themselves, when circumstances aligned in such a way that his death could be orchestrated to appear entirely accidental, you allowed events to proceed without intervention." The drawing-room door opened, and Timothy entered with 2 additional constables. He had been listening from the hallway, Miss Marple realized, positioned there by her careful maneuvering of the conversation to ensure that the confession would be witnessed by proper authority. "Marcus Ashford," Timothy said, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. "I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Dr. Pemberton. You have the right to remain silent." As Timothy read the formal caution, Marcus made no attempt to resist. Instead, he sank into a chair with the expression of someone whose carefully constructed facades had finally collapsed entirely. His eyes met his aunt's with an accusation that needed no words. They had destroyed each other through their mutual recognition of opportunity and their willingness to exploit it. But Miss Marple was not yet finished. She turned her attention to Iris Blackwood, who had appeared in the doorway during the commotion. The older woman's face bore the expression of someone whose emotions had cycled through shock, comprehension, and finally, something approaching grim satisfaction. "You knew, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked. "When you met Marcus in the gamekeeper's cottage that night, ostensibly to arrange Dr. Pemberton's escape, you discovered what had already transpired. You found him there, already dead or dying, and you understood immediately what had occurred." "I did nothing," Iris said flatly. "I returned to the manor and remained silent. Some might call that complicity. I called it justice, however complicated and imperfect." "You broke no laws," Miss Marple acknowledged, "though your silence certainly aided in the concealment of a crime. Yet I suspect you were motivated less by desire to protect Marcus Ashford and more by the recognition that Dr. Pemberton had finally paid a price for his original sin. Your sister's death had been avenged, though perhaps not in the manner you would have consciously chosen." Patricia Hartley, who had been standing silently at the edge of the gathering, began to weep. The vicar moved to her side, his hand finding hers with the tentative gesture of a man seeking redemption through simple human contact. Whatever judgment might be passed upon them, their shared knowledge of the past would bind them together in ways that transcended conventional morality. Catherine had not appeared, Miss Marple noted. The young woman was likely in her room, processing the revelation that her desperate attempt at communication, breaking that window to alert someone to the danger developing within the manor, had inadvertently participated in the orchestration of her own father's death. The guilt of that realization would likely weigh upon her far longer than any formal judgment could impose. As the constables led Marcus away, and as Margot sat in stunned silence confronting the reality of her complicity in events she had set in motion but never fully controlled, Miss Marple felt the familiar weariness that accompanied the exposure of human weakness. The Christmas gathering had concluded, but not as anyone had anticipated. The manor would return to its normal rhythms. The snow would eventually melt, and life would resume its surface appearance of respectability. Yet beneath that surface, the community of Ashford in the snow would carry the knowledge of what had transpired. Knowledge that would subtly alter every interaction, every assumption about the people who lived within its boundaries. That, Miss Marple reflected, was perhaps the truest consequence of crime. Not the legal judgment it provoked, but the permanent alteration of perception it imposed upon those who witnessed it. The roads had cleared sufficiently by the following morning to permit the departure of those who wished to leave. Margot Ashford departed shortly after breakfast, her composure restored to its customary polish, though something indefinably diminished had settled behind her eyes. She would face civil liability at minimum, though criminal charges seemed unlikely given the difficulty of proving she had explicitly commissioned her nephew's actions. Yet the knowledge of her complicity would remain a permanent shadow across her carefully constructed reputation. Catherine departed with her mother's cousin, a woman who had been summoned from the village to provide family support during what the local gossip had already begun to characterize as a tragedy rather than a crime. The young woman barely spoke during the preparations for her departure, her gaze fixed upon some distant point that suggested her mind was processing realities far more complex than her years typically required. Patricia and Reverend Hartley remained for one additional day, as though they could not quite bring themselves to return to the vicarage and resume their parish duties under the weight of their accumulated secrets. The vicar approached Miss Marple on the morning of their intended departure, seeking something that she recognized immediately as absolution rather than information. "I've been thinking about judgment," he said, settling himself in the library chair across from where Miss Marple sat with her knitting. "About the difference between the judgment of law and the judgment of conscience. Marcus Ashford will face trial. He will likely be convicted. Justice, in the mechanical sense, will be served. But Dr. Pemberton's original crime, the negligence that cost a young woman her life, that crime went unpunished for 3 decades. How does one reconcile such inequities?" Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic motion. "One doesn't reconcile them, Reverend. One acknowledges them. Justice, as dispensed by human institutions, is necessarily imperfect. It arrives too late, too inconsistently, and often to the wrong people. The law can punish Marcus Ashford for murder, but it cannot undo the moral compromises that preceded that murder. It cannot restore the years that Dr. Pemberton lived in the shadow of his own guilt, nor can it resurrect a young woman who died because a man prioritized his career over her life." "Then what is the point of any of it?" the vicar asked, his voice carrying genuine anguish. "The point," Miss Marple replied gently, "is that we continue nonetheless. We continue to seek justice even knowing it will be imperfect. We continue to acknowledge wrongdoing even when that acknowledgement brings no compensation to the wronged. We continue because the alternative, abandoning the effort entirely, is far more damaging to the human spirit than any particular failure of the system can be." The Hartleys left that afternoon, their departure marked by the kind of silence that suggested they carried with them far more than they could possibly articulate. Miss Marple watched their car disappear down the snowy lane and reflected that the most profound changes in human understanding often occurred in moments that appeared entirely ordinary to outside observers. Timothy remained, conducting the final interviews and documentation that the investigation required. He had performed admirably, Miss Marple reflected, transforming what might have been a bungled conclusion into something approaching genuine justice. His willingness to listen to her observations, to follow lines of inquiry that seemed tangential to the obvious facts, had proven crucial to the unraveling of the crime. "I've been reflecting on how you knew," Timothy said on his final evening at the manor. "How you understood the connections between seemingly disparate events. Most investigators would have accepted the suicide narrative. Most would have been satisfied with the evidence pointing toward Dr. Pemberton's guilt over his past actions. I knew because I recognized the pattern," Miss Marple replied. "Years ago, in my own village, I observed a similar situation. A man whose past crimes created vulnerability, family members whose financial circumstances made his death opportune, and layers of misdirection designed to obscure the true motivation. Human nature, Constable, is remarkably consistent. We repeat our patterns across generations and circumstances, merely adjusting the details to fit local circumstances." "But you couldn't have known all of that when you arrived at the manor," Timothy pressed. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But I could observe. I could watch how people moved through space, how they avoided each other or sought each other out, what subjects they introduced, and what subjects they carefully avoided. I could notice the small physical details: mud beneath fingernails, trembling hands, the peculiar tension of people harboring shared secrets. These observations, accumulated and considered systematically, eventually revealed a narrative that made sense of all the individual elements. As the final light of the winter day faded beyond the manor windows, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of her work. She had solved the crime, exposed the guilty parties, provided Timothy with the evidence necessary to construct a prosecution. Yet the resolution felt simultaneously complete and profoundly incomplete. Pemberton remained dead, his own crimes unpunished save by the knowledge he carried through his final hours. Margaret Blackwood remained equally dead, her death still unacknowledged by any formal legal proceeding. Marcus Ashford would face trial and likely imprisonment, but his motivation, the financial desperation that had made his aunt's implicit suggestions seem reasonable, would be dismissed as mere greed rather than examined as symptomatic of larger systemic failures. Yet perhaps, Miss Marple thought, this was the true nature of justice. Not the delivery of perfect restitution or complete accountability, but rather the acknowledgement that harm had been done, that consequences would follow, and that human communities would be forced to integrate this knowledge into their ongoing existence. The snow melted gradually over the following weeks, as snow always does, revealing the landscape of ordinary English countryside beneath. Thornfield Manor returned to its customary routines, though Margot's retirement plans had been quietly abandoned. The village of Ashford in the snow adjusted to the knowledge that murder had occurred within its boundaries, that apparent respectability concealed layers of moral compromise and human weakness. And Miss Marple returned to her cottage in St. Anne, Merry Mead, where she would resume her quiet observations of human nature, secure in the knowledge that whatever mysteries the future might present, they would ultimately yield to patient attention and careful consideration of the patterns that human behavior, for all its apparent complexity, persistently repeated.